Pilgrims to the Pecos by Robert Howard. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pilgrims to the Pecos by Robert Howard. That there wagon rolled up the trail and stopped in front of our cabin one morning just after sunup. We all come out to see who it was, because strangers ain't common on Bear Creek, and not very often welcome, neither. They was a long, hungry-looking old coot driving, and 4 or 5 growed boys sticking their heads out. "Good morning, folks," said the old coot, taking off his hat. "My name is Joshua Richardson. I'm heading a wagon train of immigrants, which is looking for a place to settle. The rest of 'em's camped 3 miles back down the trail. Everybody we met in these here Humboldt Mountings told us we'd have to see Mr. Roaring Bill Elkins about settling hereabouts. Be you him?" "I'm Bill Elkins," says Pap suspiciously. "Well, Mr. Elkins," says Old Man Richardson, wagging his chin whiskers, "we'd admire it powerful if you folks would let us people settle somewheres about." Says Pap, pulling his beard. "Whar you all from?" "Kansas," says Old Man Richardson. "Wachita," says Pap. "Get my shotgun." "Don't you do no such thing, Watchy," says Ma. "Don't be stubborn, William. The war's been over for years." "That's what I say," hastily spoke up Old Man Richardson. "Let bygones be bygones, I says." "What," says Pap ominously, "is your honest opinion of General Sterling Price?" "One of nature's noblemen," declares Old Man Richardson earnestly. Says Pap. "You seem to have considerable tact and hoss sense for a red leg, but they ain't no more room on Bear Creek for no more settlers, even if they was Democrats. They's 9 or 10 families now within a retch of 100 square miles, and I don't believe in overcrowding a country." "But we're plumb tuckered out," wailed Old Man Richardson, "and nowheres to go. We have been driv from pillar to post by settlers which got here ahead of us and grabbed all the best land. They claims it whether they got any legal rights or not." "Legal rights be damned," snorted Pap. "Shotgun rights is what goes in this country. But I know just the place for you. It's 10 or 15 days' travel from here in Arizony. It's called Bowie Knife Canyon, and it's just right for farmin' people, which I jedge you all to be." "We be," says Old Man Richardson, "but how we gonna get there?" "My son Breckenridge will be plumb delighted to guide you there," says Pap. "Won't you, Breckenridge?" "No, I won't," I said. "Why the tarnation have I got to be picked on to ride herd on a passel of tender-footed mavericks?" "He'll get you there safe," says Pap, ignoring my remarks. "He dotes on lending folks a helping hand. Don't you, Breckenridge?" Seeing the futility of argument, I merely snarled and went to saddle Captain Kidd. I noticed Old Man Richardson and his boys looking at me in a very peculiar manner all the time, and when I come out on Captain Kidd, him snorting and bucking and kicking the rails out of the corral like he always does, they turned kind of pale, and Old Man Richardson said, "I wouldn't want to impose on your son, Mr. Elkins. After all, we wasn't intending to go to that there canyon in the first place." "I'm guiding you to Bowie Knife Canyon," I roared. "Maybe you warn't going there before I saddled my hoss, but you air now. Come on." I then cut loose onto the mule's feet with my .45s to kind of put some ginger in the critters, and they brayed and sawed off down the trail, just hitting the high places, with Old Man Richardson hanging onto the lines and bouncing all over the seat, and his sons rolling in the wagon bed. We come into the camp full tilt, and some of the men grabbed their guns, and the women hollered and jerked up their kids, and one feller was so excited he fell into a big pot of beans which was simmering over a fire, and squalled out that the Injuns was trying to burn him alive. Old man Richardson had his feet braced agin the front gate, pulling back on the lines as hard as he could, and yelling bloody murder. But the mules had the bits betwixt their teeth, so I rode to their heads and grabbed them by the bridles and throwed 'em back onto their haunches. And old man Richardson ought to have knew that the stop would be sudden. 'Twarn't my fault he done a dive off the seat and hit on the wagon tongue on his head. And it weren't my fault neither that one of the mules kicked him and t'othern bit him before I could untangle him from amongst them. Mules is mean critters, howsoever you take 'em. Everybody hollered amazin', and he riz up and mopped the blood off of his face and waved his arms and hollered, "Calm down, everybody. This ain't nothin' to git excited about. This gentleman is Mr. Breckenridge Elkins, which has kindly agreed to guide us to a land of milk and honey down in Arizony." They received the news without enthusiasm. They was about 50 of them, mostly women, children, and half-grown young'uns. They weren't more'n a dozen fit fighting men in the train. They all looked like they'd been on the trail a long time, and they was all some kin to old man Richardson, sons and daughters, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, their husbands and wives, and such like. They was one real pretty gal, the old man's youngest daughter Betty, who warn't yet married. They'd jest et breakfast and was hitched up when we arrove, so we pulled out without no more delay. I rode along of old man Richardson's wagon, which went ahead with the others strung out behind, and he says to me, "If this here Bowie Knife Canyon is such a remarkable place, why ain't it already been settled?" "Aw, they was a settlement there," I said, "but the Apaches killed some, and Mexican bandits killed some, and about 3 years ago the survivors got to fighting amongst theirselves and just kind of killed each other off." He yanked his beard nervously and said, I don't know. Maybe we'd ought to hunt a more peaceful spot than that there sounds like." "You won't find no peaceful spots west of the Pecos," I assured him. "Say no more about it. I've made up our minds that Bowie Knife Canyon is the place for y'all, and we're going there." "Well, I wouldn't think of arguing the point," he assured me hastily. "What towns does we pass on our way?" "Just one," I said. "War Smoke, right on the Arizona line. Tell your folks to keep out of it. It's a hangout for every kind of a outlaw. I judge your boys ain't handy enough with weapons to mix in sech company." "We don't want no trouble," says he. "I'll tell 'em." So we rolled along, and the journey was pretty uneventful except for the usual mishaps which generally happens to tenderfeet. But we progressed until we was within striking distance of the Arizona border, and there we hit a snag. The rear wagon bogged in a creek we had to cross a few miles north of the line. They'd been a head rise, and the wagons churned the mud, so the last one stuck fast. It was getting on toward sundown, and I told the others to go on and make camp a mile west of War Smoke, and me and the folks in the wagon would foller when we got it out. But that warn't easy. It was mired clean to the hubs, and the mules was up to their bellies. We pried and heaved and hauled, and night was coming on, and finally I said, if I could get them cussed mules out of my way, I might accomplish something. So we unhitched 'em from the wagon, but they was stuck too, and I had to wade out beside 'em and lift 'em out of the mud one by one and tote 'em to the bank. A mule is a helpless critter. But then, with them out of the way, I laid hold of the tongue and hauled the wagon out of the creek in short order. Them Kansas people sure did look surprised. I don't know why. Time we'd scraped the mud off of the wagon and us and hitched up the mules again, it was night, so it was long after dark when we come up to the camp the rest of the train had made in the place I told 'em. Old man Richardson come up to me looking worried, and he says, "Mr. Elkins, some of the boys went into that there town in spite of what I told 'em." "Don't worry," I says. "I'll go get 'em." I clumb on Cap'n Kidd without stopping to eat supper, and rode over to War Smoke, and tied my hoss outside the only saloon they was there. It was a small town and awfully hard looking. As I went into the saloon I seen the 4 Richardson boys, and they was surrounded by a gang of cutthroats and outlaws. They was a Mexican there too, a tall, slim cuss with a thin black mustache and gilt braid onto his jacket. "So you think you settled in Bowie Knife Canyon, eh?" he says. And one of the boys said, "Well, that's what we was aiming to do." "I think not," he said, grinning like a cougar, and I seen his hands steal to the ivory-handled guns at his hips. "You never heard of Señor Gonzales Zamora? No? Well, he is a big hombre in this country, and he has use for this canyon in his business." "Start the fireworks whenever you're ready, Gomez," muttered a white desperado. "We're backing your play." The Richardson boys didn't know what the deal was about, but they seen they was up agin real trouble, and they turned pale and looked around like trapped critters, seeing nothing but hostile faces and hands gripping guns. "Who tell you you could settle this canyon?" asked Gomez. "Who bring you here? Somebody from Kansas? Yes? No?" "No," I said, shouldering my way through the crowd. "My folks come from Texas. My granddaddy was at San Jacinto. You remember that?" His hands fell away from his guns, and his brown hide turned ashy. The rest of them renegades give back, muttering, "Look out, boys, it's Breckenridge Elkins." They all suddenly found they had business at the bar, or playing cards, or something, and Gomez found himself standing alone. He licked his lips and looked sick, but he tried to keep up his bluff. "You maybe no like what I say about Señor Zamora," says he, "but it's truth. If I tell him gringos come to Bowie Knife Canyon, he get very mad." "Well, suppose you go and tell him now," I said, and so as to give him a good start I picked him up and throwed him through the nearest winder. He picked himself up and staggered away, streaming blood and Mex profanity, and them in the saloon maintained a kind of pallid silence. I hitched my guns forward and said to the escaped convict which was tending bar, I says, "You don't want me to pay for that winder, do you?" "Oh, no," says he, polishing away with his rag at a spittoon he must have thought was a beer mug. "Oh, no, 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 no. We needed that winder busted for the ventilation." "Then everybody's satisfied," I suggested, and all the hoss thieves and stagecoach bandits in the saloon give me a hearty agreement. "Well, that's fine," I says. "Peace is what I aim to have, if I have to lick every one in the joint to get it. You boys get back to the camp." They was glad to do so, but I lingered at the bar and bought a drink for a train robber I'd knowed at Chawed Ear onct, and I said, "Just who is this cussed Zamora that Mex was spielin' about?" "I don't know," says he. "I never heard of him before." "I wouldn't say you was lying," I said tolerantly. "You're just suffering from loss of memory. Frequently cases like that is cured and their memory is restored by a severe shock or jolt, like a lick onto the head. Now then, if I was to take my 6-shooter butt and drive your head through that whiskey barrel with it, I bet it'd restore your memory right sudden. Hold on," says he in a hurry. "I just remembered that Zamora is the boss of a gang of Mexicans which claims Bowie Knife Canyon. He deals in hosses." "You mean he steals hosses," I says. And he says, "I ain't arguing. Anyway, the cabin is very convenient for his business. And if you dump them immigrants in his front yard, he'll be very much put out." "He sure will," I agreed, as quick as I can get my hands onto him. I finished my drink and strode to the door and turned suddenly with a gun in each hand. The 9 or 10 fellers which had drawed their guns aiming to shoot me in the back as I went through the door, they dropped their weapons and throwed up their hands and yelled, "Don't shoot!" So I just shot the lights out, then went out and got on to Cap'n Kidd whilst them idiots was hollering and falling over each other in the dark, and rode out of War Smoke, casually shattering a few winder lights along the street as I went. When I got back to camp the boys had already got there, and the whole wagon train was holding their weapons and scared most to death. "I'm mighty relieved to see you back safe, Mr. Elkins," says old man Richardson. "We heard the shooting and was afeared them bullies had kilt you. Let's hitch up and pull out right now. Them tenderfoots is beyond my comprehension. They'd have all pulled out in the dark if I'd let 'em, and I believe most of 'em stayed awake all night, expecting to be butchered in their sleep. I didn't say nothing to them about Zamora. The boys hadn't understood what Gomez was talking about, and they weren't no use getting 'em worse scared than what they generally was. Well, we pulled out before daylight because I aimed to reach the canyon without another stop. We kept rolling and got there pretty late that night. It weren't really no canyon at all, but a whopping big valley, well timbered and mighty good water and grass. It was a perfect place for a settlement, as I pinted out, but tenderfoots is powerful peculiar. I happened to pick our campsite that night on the spot where the Apaches wiped out a mule train of Mexicans 6 years before, and it was too dark to see the bones scattered around till next morning. Old man Richardson was using what he thought was a round rock for a pillar, and when he woke up the next morning and found he'd been sleeping with his head onto a human skull, he liked to throw a fit. And when I wanted to stop for the noonday meal in that there grove where the settlers hanged them 7 cattle rustlers 3 years before, them folks got the willies when they seen some of the ropes still sticking onto the limbs, and wouldn't on no account eat their dinner there. You got no idea what peculiar folks them immigrants is till you saw some. Well, we stopped a few miles further on in another grove in the midst of a wide rolling country of plenty of trees and tall grass, and I didn't tell 'em that was where them outlaws murdered the 3 Grissom boys in their sleep. Old man Richardson said it looked like as good a place as any to locate the settlement, but I told him we was going to look over the whole dern valley before we chose the spot. He kind of wilted and said at least for God's sake let 'em rest a few days. I never seen folks switch tired out so easy, but I said all right, and we camped there that night. I hadn't saw no signs of Zamora's gang since we come into the valley, and thought likely they was all off stealing hosses somewhere. Not that it made any difference. Early next morning, Ned and Joe, the old man's boys, they wanted to go look for deer, and I told them not to go more than a mile from camp and be careful, and they said they would and sought out to the south. I went back of the camp a mile or 2 to the creek where Jim Dornley ambushed Tom Harrigan 4 years before and taken me a swim. I stayed longer than I intended to. It was such a relief to get away from them helpless tenderfoots for a while, and when I rode back into camp I seen Ned approaching with a stranger, a young white man, which carried himself with an air of great importance. "Hey, Pap," hollered young Ned as we dismounted. "Where's Mr. Elkins? This feller says we can't stay in Bowie Knife Canyon." "Who are you?" I demanded, emerging from behind a wagon, and the stranger's eyes bugged out as he seen me. "My name's George Warren," says he. "A wagon train of us just came into the valley from the east yesterday. We're from Illinois." "And by what right does you order people out of this canyon?" I asked. "We got the fightin'est man in the world guiding us," says he. "I thought he was the biggest man in the world till I seen you. But he ain't to be fooled with. When he heard they was another train in the valley, he sent me to tell you to git. You better, too, if you got any sense." "We don't want no trouble," quavered old man Richardson. "You got a nerve," I snorted, and I pulled George Warren's hat down so the brim came off and hung around his neck like a collar, and turned him around and lifted him off the ground with a boot in the pants, then throwed him bodily onto his hoss. "Go back and tell your champeen that Bowie Knife Canyon belongs to us," I roared, slinging a few bullets around his hoss's feet, "and we gives him 1 hour to hitch up and clear out." "I'll get even for this," wept George Warren as he streaked it for his home range. "You'll be sorry, you big polecat. Just wait till I tell Mister—" I couldn't catch what else he said. "Now I bet he's mad," says old man Richardson. "We better go, after all." "Shut up!" I roared. "This here valley's ourn, and I intends to defend our rights to it to the last drop of your blood. Hitch them mules and swing the wagons in a circle. pile your saddles and plunder betwixt the wheels. I got a idee you all fights better behind breastworks. Did you see their camp, Ned?" "No," says he, "but George Warren says it lies about 3 miles east of Iron. Me and Joe got separated, and I was swinging east round the south end of that ridge over there when I met this George Warren. He said he was out looking for a hoss before sunup and seen our camp, and went back and told their guide, and he sent him over to tell us to get out." "I'm worried about Joe," said old man Richardson. "He ain't come back." "I'll go look for him," I said. "I'll also scout their camp, and if the odds ain't more'n 10 to 1, we don't wait for them to attack. We goes over and wipes them out pronto. Then we hangs their fool sculps on our wagon bows as a warning to other sech scoundrels." Old man Richardson turned pale and his knees knocked together, but I told him sternly to get to work swinging them wagons, and clumb on to Captain Kidd and lit out. Reason I hadn't saw the smoke of the Illinois camp was on account of a thick timbered ridge which lay east of our camp. I swung round the south end of that ridge and headed east, and I'd gone maybe a mile and a half when I saw a man riding toward me. When he seen me he come lickety-split, and I could see the sun shining on his Winchester barrel. I cocked my .45-90 and rode toward him, and we met in the middle of an open flat. And suddenly we both lowered our weapons and pulled up, breast to breast, glaring at each other. "Breckenridge Elkins," says he. "Cousin Bearfield Buckner," says I, "air you the man which sent that unlicked cub of a George Warren to bring me a defiance?" "Who else?" he snarled. He always had an awful temper. "Well," I says, "this here is our valley. You all got to move on." "What you mean, move on?" he yelled. "I brung them poor critters all the way from Dodge City, Kansas, where I encountered 'em being tormented by some wuthless buffalo hunters, which is no longer in the land of the living. I've led them through fire, flood, hostile Injuns, and white renegades. I promised to lead 'em into a land of milk and honey, and I been firm with 'em, even when they weakened theirselves, even when they begged on bended knee to be allowed to go back to Illinois. I wouldn't hear of it, because, as I told 'em, I knowed what was best for 'em. I had this canyon in mind all the time, and now you tells me to move on." Cousin Bearfield rolled an eye and spit on his hand. I just waited. "What sort of reply does you make to my request to go on and leave us in peace?" he goes on. "George Warren come back to camp wearing his hat brim around his neck and standing up in the stirrups because he was too sore to set in the saddle. So I set 'em fortifying the camp whilst I went forth to reconnoiter. That word I sent you I now repeats in person. You're my blood kin, but principles come first." "Me too," I said. "A Nevada Elkin's principles is as lofty as a Texas Buckner's any day. I whooped you a year ago in Cougar Paw." "That's a cussed lie," gnashed he. "You taking a base advantage and lammed me with an oak log when I warn't expecting it." "Be that as it may," says I, ignoring the fact that you had just beamed me with a rock the size of a water bucket, "the only way to settle this dispute is to fight it out like gents. But we got to determine what weapons to use. The matter's too deep for fists." "I'd prefer butcher knives in a dark room," says he. "Only they ain't no room. If we'd just had a couple of sawed-off shotguns or good double-bitted axes. I tell you, Breck, let's tie our left hands together and work on each other with our buoys." "Nah," I says, "I got a better idea. We'll back our hosses together, then ride for the opposite sides of the flat. When we get there we'll wheel and charge back, shooting at each other with our Winchesters. Time they're empty, we'll be close enough to use our pistols, and when we've emptied them, we'll be close enough to finish the fight with our buoys." "Good idea," agreed Bearfield. "You always was a brainy, cultured sort of lobo, if you wasn't so damn stubborn. Now me, I'm reasonable. When I'm wrong, I admit it." "You ain't never admitted it so far," says I. "I ain't never been wrong yet," he roared, "and I'll carve the gizzard of the buzzard which says I am. Come on, let's get going. So we started to gallop to the opposite sides of the flat when I heard a voice hollering, "Mr. Elkins! Mr. Elkins!" "Hold on," I says. "That's Joe Richardson." Next minute Joe come tearing out of the bresh from the south on a mustang I hadn't never seen before, with a Mexican saddle and bridle on. He didn't have no hat nor shirt, and his back was crisscrossed with bloody streaks. He likewise had a cut in his scalp which dribbled blood down his face. "Mexicans!" he panted. "I got separated from Ned and rode further than I should ought to had. About 5 miles down the canyon I run into a big gang of Mexicans, about 30 of 'em. One was that fella Gomez. Their leader was a big feller they called Zamora. They grabbed me and taken my hoss and whooped me with their quirts. Zamora said they was going to wipe out every white man in the canyon. He said his scouts had brung him news of our camp and another east of ourn, and he aimed to destroy both of 'em at one sweep. Then they all got onto their horses and headed north, except one man which I believe they left there to kill me before he followed them. He hit me with his 6-shooter and knocked me down, then put up his gun and started to cut my throat with his knife. But I wasn't unconscious like he thought, so I grabbed his gun and knocked him down with it, and jumped on his hoss and lit out. As I made for camp, I heard you and this gent talking loud to each other and headed this way." "Which camp was they going for first?" I demanded. "I don't know," he said. "They talked mostly in Spanish I can't understand." "The duel'll have to wait," I says. "I'm heading for our camp." "And me for mine," says Bearfield. "Listen, let's decide it this way. The one that scuppers the most greasers wins, and the other'n takes his crowd and pulls out." "Bueno," I says, and headed for camp. The trees was dense. Them bandits could have passed either to the west or the east of us without us seeing 'em. I quickly left Joe, and about a quarter mile further on I heard a sudden burst of firing and screaming, and then silence. A bit later I bust out of the trees into sight of the camp, and I cussed earnestly. Instead of being drawed up in a circle, with the men shooting from between the wheels and holding them bandits off like I expected, them derned wagons was strung out like they was heading back north. The hosses was cut loose from some of 'em, and the mules was laying across the poles of others, shot full of lead. Women was screaming and kids was squalling, and I seen young Jack Richardson laying face down in the ashes of the campfire with his head in a puddle of blood. Old man Richardson come limping toward me with tears running down his face. "Mexicans," he blubbered. "They hit us like a hurricane. Just a little while ago they shot Jack down like he was a dog. 3 or 4 of the other boys has got knife slashes or bullet marks or bruises from loaded quirt ends. As they rolled off, they yelled they'd come back and kill us all." "Why didn't you throw them wagons round like I told you?" I roared. "We didn't want no fighting," he bawled. "We decided to pull out of the valley and find some more peaceful place. And now Jack's dead and your stock scattered," I raged, "just because you didn't want to fight. What the hell you ever crossed the Pecos for if you didn't aim to fight nobody? Set the boys together in such stock as you got left." "But them Mexicans taken Betty!" he shrieked, tearing his scanty locks. "Most of 'em headed east, but 6 or 7 grabbed Betty right out of the wagon and rode off south with her, driving the hosses they stole from us." "Well, get your weapons and follow me," I roared. "For Lord's sake, forget they is places where sheriffs and policemen protect you, and make up your minds to fight. I'm going after Betty." I headed south as hard as Captain Kidd could run. The reason I hadn't met the Mexicans as I rode back from the flat where I met Cousin Bearfield was because they swung round the north end of the ridge when they headed east. I hadn't gone far when I heard a sudden burst of firing off to the east and figured they'd hit the Illinois camp. But I reckoned Bearfield had got there ahead of 'em. Still, it didn't seem like the shooting was far enough off to be at the other camp. But I didn't have no time to study it. Them gal thieves had a big start. But it didn't do no good. I hadn't rode over 3 miles till I heard the stolen hosses running ahead of me, and in a minute I bust out into an open flat and seen 6 Mexicans driving them critters at full speed, and one of 'em was holding Betty onto the saddle in front of him. It was that blasted Gomez. I come swooping down onto him with a 6-shooter in my right hand and a bowie knife in my left. Captain Kidd needed no guidin'. He'd smelt blood and fire, and he come like a hurricane on Judgment Day, with his mane flyin' and his hoofs burnin' the grass. The Mexicans seen I'd ride 'em down before they could get across the flat, and they turned to meet me, shootin' as they come. But Mexicans always was rotten shots. As we come together, I let bam 3 times with my .45, and 3, says I. One of 'em rode at me from the side and clubbed his rifle and hit at my head, but I ducked and made 1 swipe with my bowie. 4, says I. Then the others turned and hightailed it, letting the stolen hosses run where they wanted to. One of 'em headed south, but I was crowdin' Gomez so clost he whirled round and lit a shuck west. "Keep back, or I kill the girl!" he howled, lifting a knife. But I shot it out of his hand, and he gave a yowl and let go of her, and she fell off into the high grass. He kept fogging it. I pulled up to see if Betty was hurt, but she warn't, just scared. The grass cushioned her fall. I seen her pap, and sech of the boys as was able to ride was all coming at a high run, so I left her to them, and taken in after Gomez again. Pretty soon he looked back and seen me overhauling him, so he reached for his Winchester, which he'd evidently just thought of using, when about that time his hoss stepped into a prairie dog hole and throwed him over his head. Gomez never twitched after he hit the ground. I turned around and rode back, cussing disgustedly, because Elkins is ever truthful, and I couldn't honestly count Gomez in my record. But I thought I'd scuttle that coyote that runs south, so I headed in that direction. I hadn't gone far when I heard a lot of hosses running somewhere ahead of me and to the east, and then presently I bust out of the trees and come onto a flat which run to the mouth of a narrer gorge opening into the main canyon. On the left wall of this gorge mouth they was a ledge about 50 foot up, and they was a log cabin on that ledge with loopholes in the walls. The only way up onto the ledge was a log ladder, and about 20 Mexicans was running their hosses toward it across the flat. Just as I reached the edge of the bushes, they got to the foot of the wall and jumped off their hosses and run up that ladder like monkeys, letting their hosses run anyways. I seen a big feller with gold ornaments on his sombrero, which I figured was Zamora, but before I could unlimber my Winchester, they was all in the cabin and slammed the door. The next minute, Cousin Bearfield busted out of the trees a few 100 yards east of where I was and started recklessly across the flat. Immediately, all them Mexicans started shooting at him, and he grudgingly retired into the brush again with terrible language. I yelled and rode toward him, keeping to the trees. "How many you got?" he bellered as soon as he seen me. "4," I says, and he grinned like a timber wolf and says, "I got 5. I was riding for my camp when I heard the shooting behind me, so I knowed it was your camp they hit first. I turned round to go back and help you out. When did I ever ask you for any help?" I bristled. But he said, "But pretty soon I seen a gang of Mexicans coming round the north end of the ridge, so I taken cover and shot 5 of 'em out of their saddles. They must have knowed it was me because they hightailed it." "How could they know that, you conceited jackass?" I snorted. "They run off because they probably thought a whole gang had ambushed 'em." Old man Richardson and his boys had rode up whilst we was talking, and now he broke in with some heat and said, "That ain't the question. The pint is we got 'em hemmed up on that ledge for the time bein', and can get away before they come down and massacre us." "What you talking about?" I roared. "They're the ones which is in need of getting away. If any massacreeing is did around here, we does it." "It's flying in the face of Providence," he bleated. But I told him sternly to shut up, and Bearfield says, "Send somebody over to my camp to bring my warriors." So I told Ned to go, and he pulled out. Then me and Bearfield studied the situation, setting our horses in the open whilst bullets from the cabin whistled all around us, and the Richardsons hid in the brush and begged us to be careful. "That ledge is sheer on all sides," says Bearfield. "Nobody couldn't climb down onto it from the cliff, and anybody trying to climb that ladder in the teeth of 20 Winchesters would be plumb crazy." But I says, "Look, Bearfield, how the ledge overhangs about 10 foot to the left of that ladder. A man could stand at the foot of the bluff there, and them coyotes couldn't see to shoot him." "And," says Bearfield, "he could sling his rope up over that spur of rock at the rim, and they couldn't shoot it off. Only way to get to it would be to come out of the cabin and reach down and cut it with a knife. Door opens toward the ladder, and there ain't no door in the wall on that side. A man could climb right up onto the ledge before they knowed it, if they didn't shoot him through the loopholes as he come over the rim. You stay here and shoot 'em when they tries to cut the rope,' I says. 'You go to hell,' he roared. 'I see through your hellish plot. You aims to get up there and kill all them Mexes before I has a chance at 'em. You thinks you'll outwit me. By golly, I got my rights and—' 'Aw, shut up,' I says disgustedly. 'We'll both go.' I hollered to Old Man Richardson, 'You all lay low in the bresh and shoot at every Mex which comes out of the cabin.' 'What you goin' to do now?' he hollered. 'Don't be rash.' But me and Bearfield was already heading for the ledge at a dead run. This move surprised the Mexicans because they knowed we couldn't figure to ride our hosses up that ladder. Being surprised, they shot wild, and all they done was graze my sculp and nick Bearfield's ear. Then, just as they began to get their range and start trimming us close, we swerved aside and thundered in under the overhanging rock. We clumb off and tied our horses well apart, otherwise they'd have started fighting each other. The Mexicans above us was yelling most amazing, but they couldn't even see us, much less shoot us. I whirled my lariat, which is plenty longer and stronger than the average lasso, and roped the spur of rock which jutted up just below the rim. 'I'll go up first,' I says, and Bearfield showed his teeth and drawed his bowie knife. 'You won't neither,' says he. 'We'll cut cards. High man wins.' So we squatted, and Old Man Richardson yelled from the trees, 'For God's sake, what are you doing now? They're fixing to roll rocks down onto you.' 'You tend to your own business,' I advised him, and shuffled the cards which Bearfield hauled out of his breeches. As it turned out, the Mexes had a supply of boulders in the cabin. They just opened the door and rolled them toward the rim, but they shot off the ledge and hit beyond us. Bearfield cut and yelped, 'A ace! You can't beat that.' 'I can equal it,' I says, and drawed an ace of diamonds. 'Ah, wins!' he clamored. 'Hearts beats diamonds.' 'That rule don't apply here,' I says. 'It were a draw, and—' 'Why, you—' says Bearfield, leaning forward to grab the deck, and just then a rock about the size of a bushel basket come bounding over the ledge and hit a projection, which turned its course, so instead of shooting over us, it fell straight down and hit Bearfield smack between the ears. It stunned him for an instant, and I jumped up and started climbing the rope, ignoring more rocks which was thundering down. I was about halfway up when Bearfield came to, and he riz with a bellow of rage. 'Why, you dirty double-crossing so-and-so,' says he, and started throwing rocks at me. They was a awful racket, the Mexicans howling, guns banging, Bearfield cussing, and Old Man Richardson wailing. 'They're crazy, I tell you. They're both crazy as mud hens. I think everybody west of the Pecos must be maniacs.' Bearfield grabbed the rope and started climbing up behind me, and about that time one of the Mexicans run to cut the rope. But for once my idiotic followers was on the job. He run into about 7 bullets that hit him all to once, and fell down just above the spur where the loop was caught onto. So when I retched my arm over the rim to pull myself up, they couldn't see me on account of the body. But just as I was pulling myself up, they let go of a boulder at random, and it bounded along and bounced over the dead Mexican and hit me right smack in the face. It was about as big as a pumpkin. I give a infuriated beller and swarmed up onto the ledge, and it surprised them so that most of 'em missed me clean. I only got one slug through the arm. Before they had time to shoot again, I made a jump to the wall and flattened myself between the loopholes, and grabbed the rifle barrels they poked through the loopholes and bent 'em and ruined 'em. Bearfield was coming up the rope right behind me, so I grabbed hold of the logs and tore that whole side of the wall out, and the roof fell in and the other walls come apart. In an instant all you could see was logs falling and rolling, and Mexicans busting out into the open. Some got pinned by the fallen logs, and some was shot by my embattled Kansans and Bearfield's Illinois warriors, which had just come up, and some fell off of the ledge and broke their fool necks. One of 'em run agin me and tried to stab me, so I throwed him after them, which had already fell off the ledge, and hollered, "5 for me, Bearfield." "Expletive deleted," says Bearfield, arriving onto the scene with blood in his eye and his bowie in his hand. Seeing which, a big Mexican made for him with a butcher knife, which was poor judgment on his part, and in about the flick of a mustang's tail, Bearfield had a sixth man to his credit. Now this made me mad. I seen some of the Mexicans was climbing down the ladder, so I run after them, and one turned around and missed me so close with a shotgun he burnt my eyebrows. I taken it away from him and hit him over the head with it and yelled, "Six for me too, Cousin Bearfield." "Look out," he yelled. "Zamora's getting away." I seen Zamora had tied a rope to the back side of the ledge and was sliding down it. He dropped the last 10 feet and run for a corral which was full of hosses back up the gorge behind the ledge. We seen the other Mexicans was all laid out or running off up the valley, pursued by our immigrants. So I went down the ladder and Bearfield slid down my rope. Zamora's rope wouldn't have held our weight. We grabbed our hosses and lit out up the gorge, around a bend of which Zamora was just disappearing. He had a fast hoss and a long start, but I'd overtook him within the first mile, only Captain Kidd kept trying to stop and fight Bearfield's hoss, which was about as big and mean as he was. After we'd run about 5 miles and come out of the gorge onto a high plateau, I got far enough ahead of Bearfield so Captain Kidd forgot about his hoss. Then he settled down to business and run Zamora's hoss right off his legs. They was a steep slope on one side of us and a 500-foot drop on the other, and Zamora seen his hoss was winded, so he jumped off and started up the slope on foot. Me and Bearfield jumped off too and run after him. Each one of us got him by a leg as he was climbing up a ledge. "Let go my prisoner," roared Bearfield. "He's my meat," I snarled. "This makes me 7. I wins." "You lie," bellowed Bearfield, jerking Zamora away from me and hitting me over the head with him. This made me so mad I grabbed Zamora and throwed him in Bearfield's face. His spurs jabbed Bearfield in the belly, and my cousin give a maddened beller and fell on me fist and tush. And in the battle which followed, we forgot all about Zamora till we heard a man scream. He'd snuck away and tried to mount Captain Kidd. We stopped fighting and looked round just in time to see Captain Kidd kick him in the belly and knock him clean over the edge of the cliff. "Well," says Bearfield disgustedly, "that decides nothing, and our score is a draw." "It was my hoss which done it," I said. "It ought to count for me." "Over my corpse it will," roared Bearfield. "But look here, it's nearly night. Let's get back to the camps before my followers start cutting your Kansans' throats. Whatever fight is to be fought to decide who owns the canyon, it's betwixt you and me, not them." "All right," I said. "If my Kansas boys ain't already killed all your idiots, we'll fight this out somewhere where we got better light and more room. But I just expect to find your Illinoisans writhing in their gore." "Don't worry about them," he snarled. "They're as wild as painters when they smell gore. I only hope they ain't killed all your Kansas mavericks." So we pulled for the valley. When we got there it was dark, and as we rode out of the gorge we seen fires going on the flat, and folks dancing around them, and fiddles was going at a great rate. "What the hell is this?" bellowed Bearfield. And then old man Richardson come up to us, overflowing with good spirits. "Glad to see you gents," he says. "This is a great night. Jack weren't killed after all, just creased. We come out of that great fight, whole and sound." "But what you doing?" roared Bearfield. "What's my people doing here?" "Oh," says old man Richardson, "we got together after you gents left and agreed the valley was big enough for both parties, so we decided to jine together into one settlement and we're celebrating. Them Illinois people is fine folks. They're as peace-loving as we are." "Bloodthirsty painters," I sneers to Cousin Bearfield. "I ain't no bigger liar than you air," he says, more in sorrow than in anger. "Come on. They ain't nothing more we can do. We air swamped in a mess of pacifism. The race is degenerating. Let's head for Bear Creek." This atmosphere of brotherly love is more'n I can stand." We sat our hosses there a minute and watched them Pilgrims dance and listened to 'em singing. I squints across at Cousin Barefield's face, and doggone if it didn't look almost human in the firelight. He hauls out his plug of tobacco and offers me first chaw. Then we headed yonderly, riding stirrup to stirrup. Must have been 10 miles before Captain Kidd retches over and bites Cousin Barefield's hoss on the neck. Barefield's hoss bites back, and by accident Captain Kidd kicks Cousin Barefield on the ankle. He lets out a howl and thumps me over the head, and I hit him, and then we gets our arms around each other and roll in the bresh in a tangle. We've fit for 2 hours, I reckon, and we'd been fighting yet if we hadn't scrambled under Captain Kidd's hoofs where he was feeding. He kicked Cousin Barefield one way and me the other. I got up after a while and went hunting my hat. The bresh crackled, and in the moonlight I could see Cousin Barefield on his hands and knees. "Where are ye, Cousin Breckenridge?" says he. "Air you all right?" Well, maybe my clothes was torn more'n his was, and a lip split and a rib or two busted, but I could still see, which is more'n he could say, with both of his eyes swole that way. "Sure I'm all right," I says. "How are you, Cousin Barefield?" He let out a groan and tried to get up. He made her on the second heave and stood there swaying. "Why, I'm fine," he says. "Plumb fine. I feel a whole lot better, Breck. I was afraid for a minute back there, whilst we was riding along, that daggone brotherly love would turn out to be catching." End of Pilgrims to the Pecos.